Okay, we're up to the chapter on peak oil, and this one is a doozy. If you think all the way back to chapter 3, I said I was going to connect the 3 E's, and we are now about to connect the economy to energy. This is one of the most important chapters. It's a big subject, and I wish to acknowledge that much of this chapter stands on the shoulders of the hundreds of dedicated people who have gathered the data, made the points, and tirelessly worked to advance our understanding of the role of energy in our lives. Energy is the lifeblood of any economy, but when an economy is based on an exponential debt-based money system, and that is based on exponentially increasing energy supplies, the supply of that energy deserves your very highest attention. And when we look at U.S. energy use, we see in this chart from the Department of Energy that oil represents over 50% of our total yearly energy use, while oil and natural gas together represent over 75%. We're going to examine oil in detail, although pretty much everything I'm about to say about oil applies equally to natural gas, so we'll be discussing more than 3/4 of our total energy situation. In order to understand what peak oil means, we need to share a common understanding about how oil fields work and how oil is extracted. A common misperception is that an oil rig is plunked down over an oil field, a pipe is inserted, and then oil gushes out from a big underground lake or cavern that eventually gets sucked dry. It turns out that it's pretty much just solid rock down there, and oil is only found in porous rocks like sandstone that permit the oil to flow through the rock's crevices and pores. No vast caverns or lakes of oil exist down there. Oil has to be very carefully extracted from what turns out to be a solid rock matrix. It's better to think of an oil field like a margarita, where the oil is the tequila mix and the rock is the crushed ice. When an oil field is tapped, we find that the amount of oil that comes out of it follows a very prescribed pattern over time that ends up resembling a bell curve. At first, shortly after the drink is discovered, there's just one straw in our margarita, but then, with growing excitement, more and more straws are stuck in, and more drink flows out of the glass at a faster rate. But then that dreaded slurping sound begins, and now, no matter how many new straws we insert, the amount of margarita coming out of the glass declines until it is all gone, and we're only left with ice. That's pretty much how an oil field works. Every oil field exploited to date has exhibited the same basic extraction profile. And what is true for one is equally true when we measure across many oil fields and then sum the result. Because individual fields peak, so do collections of fields. Peak oil, then, is not an abstract theory so much as it is a description of an extremely well-characterized physical process. How much remains to be discovered is a theory, but the process by which oil fields become depleted is rather well understood. Peak oil is simply a fact. Also, peak oil is not synonymous with running out of oil. At the moment of peak, somewhere right around half the oil still remains. But something interesting happens at the halfway mark. Where oil gushed out under pressure at first, the back half usually has to get laboriously pumped out of the ground at higher cost. Where every barrel of oil was cheaper to extract on the way up, the reverse is true on the way down. Each barrel becomes more costly in terms of time and money and energy to extract. Eventually, it costs more to extract a barrel of oil than it is worth, and that's when an oil field is abandoned. Here's our experience with oil in the United States. From the first well drilled in 1859 in Titus, Pennsylvania, until 1970, more and more oil was progressively pumped out of the ground. But after that point, less and less came out of the ground. It is said then that the U.S. hit a peak of oil production at around 1970 at just under 10 million barrels a day, and today produces just a little over 5 million barrels a day. Those are the facts. Counting only our crude oil consumption here, the remaining balance of our 15 million barrel a day crude oil habit is met by imports. That is, we import 2/3 of our daily petroleum needs. Now, in order to produce oil, you have to first find oil, right? It's pretty hard to pump something you haven't found. Here's the interesting part. U.S. oil discoveries peaked in 1930, which yields a gap between a peak in discovery and a peak in production of 40 years. Remember that number. Here's an interesting aside. Suppose we wanted to become independent from imported oil and decided to replace those 10 million imported barrels with some other form of energy. Those 10 million barrels represent the same energy equivalent as 750 nuclear power plants. Considering the issues we have with 104 we have operating right now, I think it's safe to say nuclear power is not a realistic candidate for eliminating oil imports. Well then, by how much would we have to increase, say, our solar, wind, biomass, renewable energy production? There, we'd have to increase our currently installed base by a factor of 2,000. Not 2,000%, 2,000 times as much. When we look at worldwide oil discoveries, we find that those increased in every decade up to the 1960s, and then have decreased in every decade since then, with future projections looking even more grim. The exact peak of discovery? That was in 1964, 44 years ago, and that is another cold, hard, indisputable fact. Remember, in order to produce oil, you have to find it first. So to all the advocates out there who hope that lots of oil remains to be found, possibly of an abiotic origin, I say, let's find it. And here is the third and final fact about production that I want to present. This is a chart of global, conventional crude oil production only. It leaves out biofuels and some other liquids. But conventional crude is the easy, high energy yield stuff, and that is what the world's past 100 years of growth has been built upon. We can see here that since mid-2004, for some reason, oil production has been flat. Whatever the reason for this is, it isn't price, because oil has climbed from $50 a barrel to $120 a barrel as of today. If ever there was a strong incentive to get oil out of the ground and off to market, this would be it. Is it possible, then, that this chart is telling us that conventional crude oil production is at peak? The twin signals of rapidly rising price and flat production certainly make a compelling argument that this is the case. Intriguingly, the global peak in discoveries was exactly 40 years prior to the leveling off of this production graph, possibly echoing the gap between the peak of U.S. discovery and production. I'm soft-pedaling this to an enormous degree. This chart concerns me. Let me be blunt. If we are already at peak, as these data suggest is possible, then we're in trouble. However, the most urgent issue before us does not lie with identifying the precise moment of peak oil. That is, truthfully, an academic distraction because the economic dislocations will begin as soon as there's a gap between supply and demand. Here's a very simple and clever way to think about the supply and demand problem that was developed by a Dallas geologist named Jeffrey Brown, which he calls the export land model. Suppose we have a hypothetical country that produces 2 million barrels of crude a day, but that is declining at 5% a year. We'd note that they'd be able to export 2 million barrels, and then after 10 years, they would still be able to export 1.25 million barrels a day. This seems manageable. But now suppose that this country uses oil themselves, as all countries do, and they are consuming 1 million barrels a day, and this internal demand is itself increasing at 2.5% a year. This is also reasonable. What happens to exports under this model? They go to zero in 10 years. Where we expected exports, we get nothing. This is the miracle of compounding, but in reverse, where exports are eaten into from both ends. It turns out that this is a very realistic scenario because we can already observe that production is declining even as demand is increasing in a number of countries. In the case of Mexico, currently the number 3 supplier of oil exports to the U.S., production declines and demand growth will entirely eliminate their exports by the year 2011 or 2012. Now, where in the world is the U.S. going to find a brand new number 3 oil supplier in the next 3 to 4 years? When world production will peak is a matter of some dispute, with estimates ranging from right now to some 30 years away. But as I said before, the precise moment of the peak is really just an academic concern. What we need to be most concerned with is that day that world demand outstrips available supply. It is at that moment of crossover that the oil markets will change forever and probably quite suddenly. First, we'll see massive price hikes. That's a given. But do you remember the food shortages that seemingly erupted overnight back in February of 2008? Those were triggered by the perception of demand exceeding supply, which led to an immediate export ban on food shipments by many countries. This same dynamic of national hoarding will certainly be a feature of the global oil market once the perception of shortage takes hold. When that happens, our concerns about price will be trumped by our fears of shortages. In order to understand why oil is so important to our economy and our daily lives, we have to understand something about what it does for us. We value any source of energy because we can harness it to do work for us. For example, every time you turn on a 100-watt light bulb, it is the same as if you had a fit human being in the basement pedaling as hard as they could to keep that bulb lit. That is how much energy a single light bulb uses. In the background, while you run water, take hot showers, and vacuum the floor, it is as if your house is employing the services of 50 such extremely fit bike riders. This slave count, if you will, exceeds that of kings in times past. It can truly be said that we are all living like kings. Although we may not appreciate that because it all seems so ordinary that we take it for granted sometimes. And how much work is embodied in a gallon of gasoline, our most favorite substance of them all? Well, if you put a single gallon in a car, drove it until it ran out, and then turned around and pushed that car home, you'd find out. It turns out that a gallon of gas has the equivalent energy of 500 hours of hard human labor, or 12 and a half 40-hour work weeks. So then how much is a gallon of gas worth, would we say? $4? $10? If you wanted to pay this poor man $15 an hour to push your car home, then we might value a gallon of gas at $7,500. Here's another example. It has been calculated that the amount of food that the average North American citizen consumes in a year requires the equivalent of 400 gallons of petroleum to produce and ship. 400 gallons of petroleum per person per year just for food. At $4 a gallon, that works out to $1,600 of your yearly food bill being spent on fuel, which doesn't sound too extreme. However, when we consider that those 400 gallons represent the energy equivalent of 100 humans working year-round at 40 hours a week, then it takes on an entirely different meaning. This puts your diet well out of the reach of most kings of times past. Just to put this in context, as it is currently configured, food production and distribution uses fully 2/3 of our domestic oil production. This is one reason why a cessation of imports would be, shall we say, disruptive. Besides the way that oil works tirelessly in the background to make our lives easy beyond historical measure, oil is a miracle in other ways. In this picture, a typical American family was asked to cart out onto their front lawn everything in their house that was derived from oil. That's quite a sight. How easily could we replace the role of oil in our style of consumer-led, growth-based economy? Not very. We currently use oil mainly for transportation, sitting right at around 70% of all oil consumption. The next biggest block is for industrial purposes, followed by residential, which means heating oil. This last tiny little sliver, that's oil used to generate electricity. With the exception of biofuels, which I'll get to later, all renewable energy resources either provide heat or electricity, meaning that even if we entirely replaced all of the electricity and heat currently provided by oil with renewables, we'd only be addressing these tiny slices right here. And in the industrial processes, oil is the primary input feedstock to innumerable necessities of life, such as fertilizer, plastics, paint, synthetic fibers, chemical processes, and flying around. When we consider other potential fuel sources, we find that they are mostly incapable of fulfilling these needs. Biofuels and coal could potentially fill some of these functions, but certainly not without a massive reinvestment program, and not anytime soon. So let's review a few key facts. You have to find oil before you can produce it. And key fact number one here is that world oil discoveries peaked in 1964. U.S. discoveries peaked in 1930, and 40 years later, production peaked. We are now 44 years after the global discovery peak. That's a fact. Key fact number two is that world production of conventional crude has been flat for the past 4 years, even as prices have increased by 140%. Taken together, key facts number one and number two suggest the possibility that peak oil is already upon us. If true, then we are going to wish with all our hearts that we had begun preparing for this moment a decade or more ago. Key fact number three, is that U.S. oil imports are the energy equivalent of more than 750 nuclear power plants, which is 7 times as many nuclear plants as currently exist here, and nearly twice the total number of nuclear plants in the entire world. Key concept, number 9 of the crash course then, is that peak oil is a well-defined process that is nothing more than a physical description of how oil fields age. We have literally thousands of studied examples under our belts, and this is not open to debate. Only when the peak might arrive is up for discussion. Mostly hidden from us in plain sight is key concept number 10. The amount of work that oil performs for you is equivalent to having hundreds of slaves. It is this work that makes our lives what they are, staggeringly comfortable by historical standards. The average middle-class life in Western society today would be the envy of most kings in times past. Key concept number 11 is that oil is a magical substance of finite supply but unlimited importance. This cannot be overstated. Transitioning from one fuel source to another is a devilishly expensive proposition, posing enormous challenges with respect to cost, scale, and time. Our species transitioned over many years from wood to coal because coal was a better fuel source. And we transitioned over several decades from coal to oil for the same reason. Nobody has been able to advance any candidates as our next source of energy. Technology is not a source of energy. It may help us to exploit our energy more efficiently, but it would be a big mistake to confuse technology with an energy source. And finally, what we need to keep a careful eye out for is the supply of oil being exceeded by demand. And this raises key concept number 12. Oil exports are being hit 2 ways, by rising demand and declining production. This raises the prospect that the moment when the world's nations finally realize there's not enough oil to supply everybody may come much sooner than most suspect. Exponential functions are hard for most humans to grasp, and oil exports are being exponentially squeezed in 2 directions, subjecting them to a surprisingly high rate of decline. And this completes an immensely brief tour through peak oil. If you've not already done so, you owe it to yourself to become knowledgeable on this subject due to its unequaled importance. I have links aplenty on the essential books, essential articles, and resources pages of my site. In the next section, we will discuss the intersection between energy and the economy, and I will make the point that it was no accident that our exponential, debt-based money system grew up at precisely the same moment that a new source of high-quality energy was discovered that proved capable of increasing exponentially right alongside it. Now we embark on the precise line of thinking that completely dominates my investing and purchasing habits, and I call it energy economics. When oil first began to be used for industrial purposes, world population stood at 1.5 billion and sailing ships still plied the waters alongside coal steamers. Since then, population has expanded more than 4 times, the world's economy by more than 20 times, and energy use more than 40-fold. We are all familiar with the massive benefits that accrued from this explosive liberation of human potential. In order to appreciate the delicacy of the continuation of this abundance, we need to understand the actual role of energy in forming our society. If we recall back to Crash Course Chapter 5, I made the point that both growth and prosperity are dependent on surplus. They are, and so is one other equally important social element. If we make this yellow box represent the total food energy available to a people, and then set it to exactly equal the amount of food those people need to get more food to stay alive, then we'd find that their society would be very rudimentary and not terribly complex. If instead these same people were able to produce just 1.2 calories for every 1 calorie expended, then they'd have the exact energy balance that existed in medieval times. This skinny 20% surplus allotment of energy is sufficient to allow rich hierarchies to form, job specializations to develop, and large works of architecture to be built. With sufficient surplus energy, humans can construct remarkably complex creations in short order, as these pictures of oil-rich Dubai taken only 17 years apart attest. Now we can state the 13th key concept of the crash course. Social complexity relies on surplus energy. Societies that unwillingly lose complexity are notoriously unpleasant places to live. Given this, shouldn't we pay close attention to how much surplus energy we've got and where it comes from? This is why we're going to take a quick tour through the concept of energy budgeting. It's the same as household budgeting, but we leave dollars out of the equation. It works like this. At any given time, there is a defined amount of energy that is available to use as we wish. Let's put everything into this yellow square: solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, coal, petroleum, natural gas, and anything I've happened to miss. That's our total energy budget, and we can use it any way we wish. But if we want to have more energy next year, we obviously are going to have to invest some of that back into finding more energy. And then we'll also have to invest some in building and maintaining the capital structure that allows us to collect and distribute that energy, and to maintain a complex society. Roads, pipelines, bridges, electrical pylons, and buildings all go into this category of capital. Now, what's left over can be used for consumption. Part of this goes to basic living needs, such as water, food, and shelter, leaving the rest for discretionary things like trips to the Galapagos and hula hoops or attending Burning Man. To simplify this even more, we can divide energy up into two big buckets: energy that must be reinvested to keep everything going, and energy that we can more or less choose what to do with. This is exactly analogous to your earnings. Suppose that your household earns $50,000 a year, and your total taxes are 30%, or $15,000. This leaves you $35,000 to buy food, pay for your shelter, purchase gasoline for your car, and maybe do a few other things besides. If this suddenly flipped around, and you found yourself with only $15,000 of take-home pay, your situation would change drastically. Perhaps you could only afford food and shelter, while the car and electronics and maybe vacations became distant memories. Your life would be forcibly simplified in terms of the number of things that you could afford to buy or do. So I want you to begin to think of the amount of energy that we have to reinvest in order to get more energy as the same thing as an unavoidable tax on your salary. And here's why. Forget all about how much money energy costs, because it's actually irrelevant, especially when money is printed out of thin air. Instead, we're going to focus on how much energy it takes to get energy, because as I'm going to show you, that is what really matters. Fortunately, the concept's easy, and it's called net energy. The way we're going to measure this is by dividing the amount of energy we get by the amount of energy we had to use in order to get that energy. Energy out over energy in. Energy in is the tax, while the energy out is your take-home pay. Imagine that if the total energy it took to get an oil well drilled was 1 barrel of oil and 100 barrels was found. We'd say that our net energy return was 100 to 1. In this example, the tax we paid out was 1 out of 100, or 1%. Another phrase for this that you may encounter is energy returned on energy invested, which goes by the acronym EROEI. We're just going to stick with energy out divided by energy in for this section, or net energy, as it's easier to visualize, and it's essentially the same thing. Now, let's make this visual by graphically comparing the relationship between energy out and energy in. The red part is the amount of energy we have to put in, and the green part is how much we got out, or the net energy. And we're displaying them such that they always sum to 100%. In this first scenario, the energy out divided by energy in yields a value of 50, meaning that 1 unit of energy was used to find and produce 50 units of energy. In other words, 2% was used to find and produce energy, leaving us a net 98% to use however we see fit. We could also call this part the surplus energy available to society. Even at a net energy ratio of only 15, the surplus energy available to society remains quite high. This surplus energy, of course, is what supports all of our economic growth, our technological progress, and our wonderfully rich and complicated society. Now, I want to draw your attention to what happens over here on this part of the chart between the readings of 10 and 5. The net energy available to society begins to drop off in a manner that should be familiar to you after seeing the section on exponential charts. Only this hockey stick points down. Below a reading of 5, and the chart heads down in earnest, hitting 0 when it gets to a reading of 1. When it takes 1 unit of energy to get a unit of energy, there is 0 surplus, and there's really no point in going through the trouble of getting it. Below a reading of 5, we are on the energy cliff. To find out why this is an enormously important chart, let's look at our experience with net energy with respect to oil. In 1930, for every barrel of oil used to find oil, it is estimated that 100 were produced, giving us a reading of 100 to 1, which would be way off this chart to the left. By 1970, fields were a lot smaller and the oil often deeper or otherwise trickier to extract, and the net energy gain was now down to a value of 25 to 1. Still a very good return with lots of green beneath it. By the 1990s, this trend continued, with oil finds returning somewhere between 18 and 10 to 1. And today, it is estimated that recent oil finds are returning only 3 to 1 net energy. Why is this net yield dropping? Because in the past, a relatively small amount of energy was required to create the metal for a smallish rig, and the finds were massive and plentiful and relatively shallow. Today, much more energy is required to find energy. Exploration ships and rigs are massive. If we put our humble 1930s rig to scale, it looks like this. And today, more wells are being drilled to greater depths to find and produce smaller and smaller fields, all of which weigh upon our net energy return. And what about the allegedly massive amounts of oil contained within the so-called tar sands and oil shales, the ones that are often described as equivalent to several Saudi Arabias? The net energy values for these are especially poor and in no way comparable to the 100 to 1 returns found in Saudi Arabia. Further, the water and environmental costs associated with them are disturbingly high. And what about renewable energy sources? Methanol, which can be made from biomass, sports a net energy of about 3, while biodiesel offers a net energy return of somewhere around 2. Corn-based ethanol, if we're generous, might produce a net energy return of just slightly over 1, but could also be negative according to some sources. If we add in all the other new sources for usable liquid fuels that we just talked about, we see that they are all somewhere on the face of the cliff. Unless we very rapidly find ways of boosting the net energy of these options, we'll simply find far less surplus energy for our basic needs and discretionary wants. Solar and wind are both capable of producing pretty high net returns, but these are producing electricity, not liquid fuels, for which we already have an extensive investment in distribution and use. Oh, and by the way, where's the so-called hydrogen economy on this chart? Right here. Because there are no hydrogen reservoirs anywhere on Earth, every single bit of it has to be created from some other source of energy, at a loss. In other words, hydrogen is an energy sink. In creating hydrogen, we always lose energy, and that's not pessimism, that's the law. The second law of thermodynamics, to be exact. Because hydrogen is a carrier of energy, not a source, it is more accurately described like this: a battery. Now, to make an absurd argument, because nobody would be this foolish, suppose Congress made the decision to, say, try and run our society on corn-based ethanol. What could we expect there? Well, if we adjust our graph to reflect that decision, we'll see a whole lot of red and very little green. The tax is very high, while our take-home pay is very low. By way of commentary, I find it somewhat telling that out of all the possible alternative energy sources, this is the one that Congress chose to advance. I mean, short of directly launching barrels of oil into outer space, it's hard to imagine a much more foolish idea. The important point here, though, is that even if the government completely subsidized ethanol to the point that it only cost you a penny a gallon to buy, we would soon find ourselves ruined. And the reasons why have already been covered. With less surplus energy, less societal complexity is possible. Under an ethanol regime, we'd find that many cherished job positions would simply vanish. Regulatory compliance specialists for food additives would have to revert to being farmers. Pediatric radiological oncologists would become healers. And Midwest regional communications coordinators for Special Olympics would have to find something else to do. And so on. If we tried to live on ethanol as a liquid fuel, we'd quickly lose nearly all of the specialized jobs that we associate with modern society, because there would be practically no surplus energy to use in support of that complexity. This diagram, with a rich balance of reinvested and consumed energy, would rapidly become this. Because of their low net energy, ethanol and other such poor energy sources are thoroughly incompatible with our current lifestyles. This turns into this. So let's review the two key concepts so far before moving on. Number 13, the price of energy is irrelevant. Net energy is everything. On this basis, both corn-based ethanol and hydrogen are dismal failures. Key concept number 14, social complexity is built upon surplus energy. If we want to maintain our society in its current form, we're going to have to master this concept and fast. Okay, now we are finally ready to marry the economy to energy. In a recent interview, Peter Schiff of Euro-Pacific Capital described economics as the science of satisfying unlimited demand with limited resources. Given our druthers, most humans would choose to live the life of a billionaire, but this is clearly not possible, even with our current massive abundance of surplus energy. Luckily for us, we've had massive amounts of surplus energy to work with over the past 100 years. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Remember all these exponential graphs? In theory, there's nothing problematic with living in a world full of exponential growth and depletion curves, as long as the world does not have any boundaries. However, exponential functions take on enormous importance when they approach a physical boundary, as seems to be the case for oil in the very near future. Both discoveries and production indicate that we could be at oil's exponential boundary already. Population, money, and oil demand are all exhibiting exponential behavior. Of the three, we can make a very strong case that both population and our money system are utterly dependent on the continued expansion of oil energy. And here are the questions that arise from that line of thinking. What if our exponentially based economic and monetary systems, rather than being the sophisticated culmination of human evolution, are really just an artifact of oil? What if all of our rich societal complexity and all of our trillions of dollars of wealth and debt simply are the human expression of surplus energy pumped from the ground? It's an interesting thought. More immediately, you and I would be perfectly within our rights to wonder what will happen when, not if, but when oil begins to decline. What will happen to our exponential debt-based money system during this period? Is it even possible for it to function in a world without constant growth? These are important questions and they deserve serious answers. And by placing oil consumption on a 4,000-year timeline, all sorts of troubling questions pop up when we overlay a population curve on top of it. Together, these graphs say that we might want just a little dose of adult-sized planning to go with our usual election year hoopla. Central banking just happened to come into maturity coincident with an exponentially exploitable energy source and became all-powerful and revered within a very short period of time. Fiat money systems have come and gone, but this one had a trillion-barrel energy tailwind that is about to turn into a headwind. Distributing ever larger shares of money during a period of constant growth is a pleasant job that enjoys broad political and popular support. Operating in a world of declining energy is an utterly new prospect for every single political and financial institution. And so now it is up to us, you and me, to wonder what we should expect in the future from a money system whose most very basic assumption of them all might be an error. What if the assumption that the future will not just be bigger, but exponentially bigger than the present is incorrect? This assumption is on full display in the debt chart of the U.S. as compared to GDP. The red circle betrays a profound belief that the future will be much, much larger than the present. Consider that the total economy of the U.S. is only some $14 trillion, while the total credit market debt of the U.S. is more than $49 trillion. Lop off a few zeros and round things off, and this is the exact same thing as a bank loaning $500,000 for a home against a salary of $140,000. If we knew that the current tax bracket of the borrower was going to double and then triple again, would this be a good loan to make? To our nation, the end of cheap oil means a sustained and permanent reduction in our after-tax take-home pay. My question is, who in their right mind loans more and more money to someone whose earnings are all but guaranteed to decline? Here's how it all sums up for me. There are some knowns. We know that energy is the source for all growth and complexity. We know that surplus energy is shrinking. We know that the age of easy oil is over. And we know that because of this, oil costs will consume an ever greater proportion of our total budget. And because of these knowns, there are some risks that come along. There is the risk that our exponential money system will cease to operate in a world of declining energy surplus. It might simply not be suited to the task. And there is the risk that our society will be forced to become less complex. If you really think about it, that is a loaded sentence right there. And finally, there is the risk that even as oil winds down, the momentum of the money system will create conditions ripe for hyperinflation. Each one of these knowns adds to each one of these risks, and that is what this course is all about, assessing those risks and deciding what, if anything, a prudent adult should do about adapting to these realities and facing these risks. When I put these together, I feel comfortable making these predictions. Remember, I reserve the right to change these with the arrival of new information at a later date. The status quo will be preserved at all costs. Politicians will hide the truth, economic statistics will become even fuzzier, and central banks will continue to throw more and more money at a system that at its core is out of tune with reality. Number 2, hyperinflation will result. The price of anything is a function of how many dollars are floating around and how much of that product or good there happens to be. Because literally every single failed fiat currency regime has failed for the same reasons, we can reasonably conclude that the future will be filled with ever more dollars. At the same time, declining surplus energy will assure that there are fewer goods floating around. Together, these spell inflation. Number 3 is the logical outflow of numbers 1 and 2. Standards of living will decline. However, I am living proof that even as one's standard of living declines, one's quality of life can go up. Yet, it is entirely possible that I am raising issues here that will play out over many years or even decades, and almost certainly will be influenced by changes in behavior and technology. But the point cannot be denied. We are squandering precious time and remaining energy in a desperate, certainly foolish, and possibly ultimately unpleasant bid to preserve the status quo. We must not fall into this trap. And on that note, we're almost through. Next, we tie the first 2 E's to the environment, where I will focus on the exponential extraction of resources and modification and depletion of critical support systems. Congratulations, you have made it to the final chapter of data. The remaining 2 chapters are summaries and conclusions. Let me start right out by saying that this is not going to be about global warming. Instead, I want to focus on more linear, less complicated, and I believe more immediate concerns. The primary intent of the crash course is to show you that there's a bit of a disconnect between an exponential money system that enforces a creed of constant growth and living on a spherical planet. In this section, a lot of you are going to find out that the planet is a whole lot smaller than you might have thought. Most of the reason is contained in this curve right here, population. Consider that the entire human population finally reached 3 billion people in 1960, and that projections call for adding another 3 billion people in only 42 more years. Before we contemplate 50% more humans in only 40 years, let me show you the pickle in which the current crop already finds itself. This year, there will be 70 million more humans on the surface of the planet than last year. 70 million. To put that in context, that is nearly 3 times as many people as live in the top 10 most populous U.S. cities combined. Worldwide population growth is equivalent to 3 of each of these cities each year for the next 40 years. More people means more demand for resources, more aluminum, more food, more consumer goods shipped to more places, and more cars. Always more cars. And in case anybody has the misperception that maybe this isn't such a big deal because maybe these people will be living in China in a dirt hovel with maybe a donkey in a wicker basket, let me show you one of the fastest growing cities in the world. In many respects, it is newer and more modern than most Western cities. This is what everybody aspires to. And people are the same the world over. We all want to live in bright, shiny cities, and we want to shop for nice things in nice districts. As a quick aside, China is said to have between 1.3 and 1.6 billion citizens. This means that the entire U.S. population of 300 million people, or 0.3 billion, would be referred to by the Chinese as a rounding error. In fact, if we combine the top 5 most populous cities in the U.S., we'd find that they would have fewer inhabitants than the largest city in China. But I want to return to the earlier statement that over the next 40 years, another 3 billion people will crowd onto the surface of the planet. One trait that humans share with all organisms is that we use the easiest to obtain and the highest quality resources first. When we use the Earth's resources, we start with the richest, deepest soils, with the largest trees, and the richest fishing waters. That is, we naturally exploit the highest quality resources first. At this point, I want to recall that oil is a finite natural resource, and because of this, we find that individual oil fields and collections of oil exhibit a classic extraction profile that resembles a bell curve. We can broaden this concept to create a generalized resource extraction profile where we start with the closest, richest, and most accessible and highest grade resources first before moving on to successively harder and poorer and thinner or more distant resources. What this means is that over time, the energy required to obtain those resources goes up, as do the costs. About this, there really can be no doubt. Here's an example. When we first came to this country, we were finding some pretty spectacular things just lying around, like this copper nugget. Soon, these were all gone, and we were onto smaller nuggets, and then onto copper ores that had some of the highest concentrations. Now we have things like the Bingham Canyon mine in Utah. It is 2.5 miles across and 3/4 of a mile deep, and it started out as a mountain. It sports a final ore concentration of just 0.2%. Do you think we'd have gone to all this effort if there were still massive copper nuggets lying around in a stream bed? No way. Let's take a closer look. You see that truck way down there? It's fueled by petroleum, diesel specifically. If we couldn't spare the diesel to run that truck, what do you suppose we'd carry the ore out with? Donkeys? These trucks carry 255 tons per load. Supposing a donkey could carry 150 pounds, this means this truck carries the same in a single load as 3,400 donkeys. That's quite a lot of donkeys. My point here is that a hole in the ground a couple of miles across and 3/4 of a mile deep is a pretty spectacular display of the use of energy. When energy begins to get scarce, it seems unlikely to me that we'll be digging too many more holes like it, which means copper will become scarce. Now here's where the concept gets interesting. The amount of energy and money that is required to extract any mineral or metal is a function of the ore grade. We would measure that as the percent of the ore that consists of the desired substance. So a 10% copper ore, for example, would contain 10% copper and 90% other stuff, like, I don't know, rocks or something. If we plot out how much other stuff we have to extract and then dispose of in pursuit of our desired substance, we get a chart that looks like this. Does this look familiar to you? It should. It's an exponential chart. It tells us that if we had an ore body with only 0.2% copper in it, we'd need to mine 500 pounds of ore in order to extract 1 pound of copper. I used this particular value because that happens to be the concentration of the Bingham Canyon mine. This helps to explain why this hole is so big. It tells us that without these giant trucks, we probably wouldn't be mining such low ore grades. It means that we are already on the far right edge of this bell curve in terms of energy and cost. Do we do this because we like the challenge of low ore grades? No, we do it because we've already high-graded all the other known ore bodies, and this is what we're down to. We do it because it's the best option left. We do it because in only 200 years we've already burned through all of the better grades. Let's look at another example, coal. Coal production, as measured by tons mined, has been steadily growing at 2% a year since the 1940s. This sort of stable, continuous, exponential growth is exactly what our economy and society demand. President Bush recently said that we have 250 years of coal left, implying that this red arrow can continue in this direction for another 250 years. In other words, there is no urgency here, just a whole lot of coal waiting for us to come and get it. But there's a wrinkle in this story. Coal comes in several different grades. The most desirable is shiny, hard, black anthracite coal. It yields the most heat when burned and has a low moisture content and is highly valued in the steelmaking industry. Then comes bituminous coal, offering slightly less energy per pound of weight, and then subbituminous, and then finally something called lignite, which is really, really low energy, high moisture stuff called brown coal that is pretty much only useful for burning. The next grade below lignite is rocks, which burn only slightly less vigorously than lignite. Let's look at the U.S. history with mining anthracite. Notice a trend here? The reason we're not mining more of the stuff is because it's pretty much all gone. Our entire bequeathment of anthracite, formed over hundreds of millions of years, was largely used over a span of about 100 years. So we moved on to the next best stuff, bituminous coal. And here we might note that a peak in production was actually hit in 1990. Was this because we lost interest in this better grade of coal? No, it simply means that we started to run out of it. Naturally, we then moved on to the next grade, subbituminous coal, which we can see here making up the difference. And even lignite is getting into the game, although I don't expect to see this line really begin to move up until the subbituminous coal production has peaked out. Now we get to the really interesting part. Remember I said that the heat content or available free energy of coal got progressively worse with each grade? If we plot the total energy content of the coal mined instead of the tonnage, we get a very different picture. Where the tonnage has been moving up in a nice, steady, neat 2% climb, we note that the total energy has leveled off and has climbed by exactly 0% over the last 9 years. So we're using more energy and spending more money to mine more and more coal, but we're receiving less and less back from those efforts? Let's bring back this image again. Where do you think we are on this curve with respect to coal? Are the best years still in front of us? Do you feel secure with the 250 years of coal that the President has said we have left? The net energy of coal varies quite widely, but in extracting lignite we are already pretty far down this net energy curve. Well, that's okay, we can switch to uranium, right? It turns out there's a little wrinkle in this story too. When we look at the ore grades that exist for uranium, we see that they range from a high of over 20% to as low as 0.007%. Of all the ore grades proven and inferred to exist, 30% of them are greater than 0.1% in purity, leaving 70% below the grade of 0.1%. Only one country, Canada, has proven reserves at a higher grade than 1%, while 11 countries have already entirely exhausted their uranium ores. When we consider ore grades in such extremely low concentrations, the mining yields are quite dramatic, but not in a good way. Here's where 70% of the known uranium reserves lie, requiring that anywhere from 500 pounds to 10,000 pounds of ore body be removed and processed to obtain a single pound of the mineral, uranium oxide. Clearly, as with copper, we are slipping down a slope of declining ore concentrations for uranium, and it cannot be disputed that greater energy and cost is demanded at this end of the curve. Just in the sake of interest, France gets 90% of its electricity from nuclear power, but their uranium extraction peaked in the late 1980s, while the US passed its mining peak in the early 1980s. Both countries are well past peak uranium. If uranium is the energy of the future lies somewhere outside of these two countries. In fact, this same general theme naturally applies to anything we humans set our attention to. Phosphorus, essential mineral for farming, fish in the oceans, and every single source of metal are all telling the same story. We are running out of high-grade materials. For most things, there is either already a shortage or one will soon arise within the next few decades. And even these assessments assume that sufficient energy exists, allowing us to dig as many mile-deep pits as we wish in our quest for the last low-grade ores. The story here is that we as a species, all over the globe, have already mined the richest ores, found the easiest energy sources, and farmed the richest soils. It is said that for every bushel of wheat taken to market, a bushel of topsoil is lost. In that sense, given that it takes hundreds of years to form a single inch of topsoil, it can be said that our farmers are actually mining the soil. We have taken several hundreds of millions of years of natural ore body and energy deposition, and thousands of years of soil creation, and largely burned through them in the few years since oil was discovered. It is safe to say that in human terms, once these are gone, man, they're gone. Another measure of human activity is that certain sensitive ecosystem stress markers are showing up. Species loss is one example, but there are many others, such as the dead zones that are appearing all over the globe in the shallow seas. In fact, if one cares to look, there are red lights flashing all over our collective dashboard, ranging from species loss to oceanic depletion to aquifer depletion to topsoil loss, energy depletion, and so on. When I get even one red warning light on my dashboard, I pull right over to see what's wrong. So far, my sense is that the world is stepping on the gas pedal instead. And driving every single bit of this is simply this: 70 million new people arrive on the surface of the planet each year. This means that a stunning 50% increase in the number of humans clamoring for natural resources will have to be negotiated over the next 40 years. If we get clever about this, my sense is that we can do just fine. If we simply choose to grow, though, because that's what our money system requires, and that's the default position for our politicians, then it seems likely that we'll simply go faster until we hit a wall. The choice seems clear. Either we undertake voluntary change now, or we face involuntary change later. Now, back to the economy. Its primary assumption that the future will not just be bigger, but exponentially bigger than the present, is going to have to contend with this reality. I submit to you that these limits are going to play out in very real terms over the next 20 years. And so we can finally put all three E's into one spot. Our economy is based on an exponential money system that explicitly enforces a paradigm of continuous growth and implicitly assumes that the future will be much larger than the present. Growth requires energy. There's no getting around that. So the trends in energy stand in stark contrast to the major underlying assumption upon which our entire economy and our entire way of life are founded. Peak energy is a very real, very close prospect. In the rest of the environment, we see very clearly that we humans have high-graded virtually every resource, and we are now working our way into poorer, thinner, and deeper territory as we seek the resources that define our lifestyles. Biosystem stress is flashing warning signs on our dashboard. Pretending that we can just carry on consuming as we have while the world population increases by another 50% over the next 40 years is just not a workable plan. In fact, it's no plan at all. The continued exponential extraction of resources is a difficult enough story to believe just given the depleting ore grades that we are witnessing. But when we combine that reality with what we know about our energy supplies, then the story becomes even more unworkable. Because each of the key environmental resources upon which we depend, metals and minerals, soil, water, oceanic fish, and all the rest, have been high-graded, their continued extraction is going to increasingly be in competition for dwindling energy supplies that we'd also like to use to transport ourselves, to construct buildings, and to stay warm. Taken together, it becomes quite clear that our challenge is to adapt to a world of less, not more. A world where we have to put more energy into carefully managing what we have than seeking out new sources to exploit. We have an economic system that must grow, coupled to an energy system that can't grow, both of which are linked to a world of rapidly depleting resources. Out of the 3 E's, this is the one that is going to be doing the changing, and you need to be ready for that. That's what this entire crash course has been about. Let me make this even simpler. I want to be sure to get this point across very clearly. Our economy must grow to support a money system that requires growth, but is challenged by an energy system that can't grow. And both of these are linked to a natural world that is rapidly being depleted. Let me close by saying that if I thought these represented unfixable problems, I would not have dedicated full-time the last 4 years of my life developing this crash course and raided my bank account to make it freely available to all. I am an optimist, and I want a better future of our own design. We can no longer afford pleasant platitudes about 250 years of coal left without appreciating the actual details involved. It's time to think big. Develop a clear sense of priorities, and cast off the adolescent view that nothing bad is going to happen to us because so far it hasn't. And it's time to show that we care about future generations. For better or worse, you happen to be alive at one of the most dramatic turning points in our species' history that ranks right up there with climbing down out of the trees. The only real question is, what role do you want to play? Shall your life be filled with fear or a resolute sense of purpose? The only way these challenges can become insurmountable is if we let them by ignoring them for too long. What I am offering is a comprehensive view of how all our problems are actually interrelated and need to be viewed as such, or solutions will continue to elude us. So let's review the key trends which appear to be converging on a very narrow window of the future. We began with an understanding of money, and the fact that our money is loaned into existence with interest, and that this results in powerful pressures to keep the amount of credit, or money, constantly growing by some percentage every year. This is the very definition of exponential growth, which we can easily see in our money, and of course, inflation charts. Keeping this dynamic in mind, we encountered the data on debt, which is really a claim on the future, vastly exceeding all historical benchmarks. The flip side to this, but a significant sociological trend in its own right, is the steady erosion of savings observed over the exact same period of time. Combined, we have the highest levels of debt ever recorded, coincident with some of the lowest levels of savings ever recorded. And we saw that our failure to save extends through all levels of our society and even includes a desperate failure to invest in our infrastructure. Next, we saw how assets, primarily housing, have been in a sustained bubble, and that is now bursting, and will take many years to play out. When credit bubbles burst, they result in financial panics that end up destroying a lot of capital. Actually, that's not quite right. This quote says it better. Panics do not destroy capital. They merely reveal the extent to which it has been previously destroyed by its betrayal into hopelessly unproductive works. So we learned that a bursting bubble is not something that's easily fixed by authorities because their attempts to limit further damage are misplaced. The damage has already been done. It is contained within too many houses and too many strip malls sold for too high prices, and too many goods imported and bought on credit. All of that is done. All that's left is figuring out who ends up holding the bag, and right now, these guys are working hard to assure that that's you, the taxpayer. Then we learned that the most profound U.S. government financial shortfalls rest with a demographic problem that itself cannot be fixed by any act of law or any level of optimism. It is simply a fact. An inconvenient fact of circumstance, much like gravity sometimes, but a fact nonetheless. Even more than this, we learn that the assets boomers use to describe their wealth, stocks and bonds and real estate, all have to be sold to somebody at some point in order to extract their value. And we raise the uncomfortable observation that there simply are fewer people behind the boomers to whom these assets can be sold. When sellers exceed buyers, values fall. Through all of this, the economic numbers that we reported to ourselves were systematically debased until they no longer reflected reality. If false data leads to bad decisions, then it's no wonder that we find ourselves in our current predicament. Only by returning to an honest self-appraisal can we plot a strategic and meaningful course to the future. Then we learn that energy is the source of all economic activity and that oil is by far the most important source of energy. Our entire economic configuration is built around the assumption of unlimited growth in energy supplies, but this is an easily refuted proposition. Individual oil fields peak, and so do collections of them. And so peak oil is not so much a theory as it is an observation about how oil fields age. We then explored the tension that obviously exists between a monetary system that enforces exponential growth and the fact that our primary energy source has either already peaked or will soon. Somehow, the U.S. has not even begun to invest in a future without cheap oil. We have no plan B. Lastly, we noted that the environment, meaning the world's resources and natural systems upon which we depend, is exhibiting clear signs that our exponential population is driving exponential exploitation of resources, hastening their final depletion and altering ecosystems at an alarming rate. Also, we learned that even minor changes to the systems we depend on, such as shifting rainfall patterns, can create massive, usually unplanned costs that will take priority over other needs. And yes, we've faced problems before and will face these as well. The concern comes when we view them all at once. Placed on a timeline, we see that a bursting housing bubble is already happening just as the first wave of boomers enters retirement. At the same time, peak oil demand will outstrip supply, forcing an enormously expensive adjustment, even as unknowable costs associated with resource depletion and a shifting climate lurk in the not-too-distant future. And sitting over all of this, limiting our options, will be our national failure to save and invest, and historically unprecedented levels of debt. This timeline, stretching from now to 2020, reveals a truly massive set of challenges converging on an exceptionally short window of time. The question becomes, where will the money come from to apply to each of these challenges if our savings are depleted and our debt levels are already in uncharted territory? Any one of these events will prove to be a difficult strain on our national economy, while any two could be disruptive. If three or more happen simultaneously, it's not hard to foresee the economic destruction of our country as a result, or perhaps the dollar utterly ruined as a store of wealth. How many trillions will be required to fund boomer retirement? How many trillions to reshape our transportation infrastructure to accommodate peak oil? Where will the tens of trillions come from to make up shortfalls in pensions and entitlement programs? How do we make good on these pension and entitlement promises while burdened with the highest debt loads ever seen? Where does the money come from to clean up the aftermath of a bursting housing bubble? How much more expensive will food and minerals be in the future when oil is peaked but many more people are placing higher demands on increasingly marginal resources? Each of these key trends or threats will take years, if not decades, to address, and yet we find them all parked almost directly in front of us without any serious national discussions or planning. With every passing day, we squander precious time while the problems grow larger and more costly, if not thoroughly intractable. Buying time is not a strategy and will prove to be a disastrous tactic. The mark of a mature adult is someone who can manage complexity and plans ahead. My opinion is that with few exceptions, the current political and corporate leadership of this country are doing neither. We need to change this. It is long past time to give up the adolescent notion that we can have our cake, eat it too, and borrow more when it's gone. It is time, quite simply, to return to living within our natural and economic budgets. We need to set priorities, set a budget, and stick to both. And you? If you haven't already, you need to begin to embrace the possibility that the path to the future might not be straight. It may take a few twists and turns and end up somewhere entirely unexpected. And that you happen to be alive at one of the most interesting points in human history, a time when a great shift may occur. This can be frightening or it can be exhilarating, and that choice is yours. So what do we do about all this? What can you do, and what steps should you be considering right now? Welcome to Chapter 20. This chapter is the final integration of all the prior chapters and attempts to provide clarity around the question of what should I do? Let me rephrase that. What should we do? Because the changes that are potentially coming are not solvable alone. Chapter 20 is not going to be a simple list of things to do. Instead, it will reflect my goal of each person assuming responsibility for their own actions. Chapter 20 is going to provide a framework for action. This will be a way of structuring all the myriad things you could do into the prioritized list of things that you will do. Consider it your personal risk mitigation plan. Okay, you've seen the entire crash course showing how the economy, energy, and the environment are interlinked. Specifically, you've seen that there's a substantial mismatch between an economic model that must grow and a physical world of peaking oil and depleting resources. We cannot possibly solve any one of these three main issues in isolation, because doing so will simply create new problems in one of the other E's. Truly non-status quo solutions are called for, which means there's a very real chance that our collective path will not be a linear extrapolation of the present. Our individual challenge is to accept the possibility that the future may be quite a departure from the present. I believe that the future is not some purely random roll of the dice, and that we can minimize future disruptions in our own lives by taking actions today. In one way, I am glad to have waited to produce this final chapter because we've had the great financial panic of the fall of 2008, and we can more precisely map where this is all headed. The multi-trillion-dollar bailout packages offered to banks by various governments across the globe are nearly 100% dedicated towards preserving the status quo. But at the same time, none of these challenges or trends are going to be helped in the slightest by bailing out the banking system, and some will even be made worse. The fact that our national leaders have chosen to go several $trillion further into debt in a desperate bid to preserve what was simply indicates that it is now even more probable that the burden of meeting these challenges has shifted a bit further towards private citizens and small communities. Part of the complication with developing a What Should We Do chapter is that I have no idea where your beliefs lie. Everybody exists somewhere along this spectrum of belief, ranging from expecting a rather ordinary, if not slight interruption in economic growth, all the way on up to a big breakdown. Everybody exists along here somewhere. And depending on where you happen to sit, both the number of things you could do and their urgency increases dramatically. Given this, where do we start? How do we get started when there are so many variables and things that need doing? This is why we need a framework for action. There are 4 sequential steps to this framework. First, you have to decide that you're going to take action. Without this commitment, there's not much point in continuing. Second, you need to take stock of where you are, and here I propose a self-assessment that will unearth your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. Third, you've got to sort out from among the infinite list of things you could do. And fourth, you've got to prioritize that list because you can't do everything. Together, these create the framework for action. So let's begin with step 1, the case for action. First, let's add some detail to the spectrum I laid out before. Here, we might assess the potential for disruption as beginning with status quo, meaning that all the key risks dissipate relatively rapidly. Next on the spectrum would be a prolonged recession and all that that entails. Next, we might place a collapse of the financial system on here. And finally, we might even envisage a collapse of government services at all levels. I am pretty certain that our future lies somewhere along this spectrum. The problem is, I don't know where. The key here is that I cannot entirely rule out any particular outcome. I can't place a probability of 0 next to any of these, so I need to weigh them all. Let's play a little thought game with one of them, and see how it might lead to making a case for action. Let's use number 3, financial system collapse. Without worrying about how likely or probable a financial crisis might be, let's simply say that it is either true or it's false. That is, it either happens or it doesn't. Hopefully we can all agree that true or false pretty much covers the total range of possible outcomes. And down on this axis, we'll say that you either prepared for this crisis or you did not. Again, it is either true or false that you chose to take steps to mitigate the impact of the financial crisis. So what happens if it's both true that the crisis happened and that you did prepare as best you could? Congratulations, give yourself a smiley face. You did the best you could. And what about the case where the crisis did not happen and you did not prepare? Again, congratulations, you did the best you could. It turns out that these are essentially equivalent outcomes, and we can therefore remove them from our decision framework. In each case, we got the best outcome we could, so there's not much to be gained from weighing and comparing them any further. But what about this case, where the crisis did not happen, but you did prepare? How bad could that be? What's the worst that you could put in this box? Well, you probably wasted some money, maybe the opportunity to participate in capital gains in the stock market. Maybe you wasted some time, but perhaps worst of all, you ended up feeling foolish. Now that's awful. Now let's compare this box to this other box where the financial crisis happened, but you did not prepare. What can we put in this box? Here it's possible that you suffered a massive loss of wealth, had to make some sudden massive adjustments under the pressure of little time and scarce resources, and live with a sense of recrimination for having been right in your concerns, but unprepared nonetheless. I'm certain you could put a bunch more things in each of these two boxes, and you should, but for our purposes we're done. Now all we have to do is compare these two boxes. That's it. In the scheme of things, which is worse? Where would you rather be? We are all built differently, but I'm of the sort that could never forgive myself for being right but unprepared. I can more easily forgive myself for being wrong and prepared, but that's just me. Only you know which of these two boxes carries more weight for you. But if you pick the upper right box, then I need to ask you, what's preventing you from taking action? Here's a slight refinement of this thinking that allows for more subtlety than true or false can provide. Suppose that we revisit our spectrum for a financial crisis that spans everything from it's not too bad all the way up to everything breaks down and stops working for a while. Let's assume that everyone has a different assessment of how likely any particular outcome is. We might find that one person assesses the chance is very low that anything too bad will happen, while another person holds a nearly opposite view. In one important respect, though, they both hold the same view. They both hold the possibility of a bad outcome as being greater than 0. When an outcome has a potentially huge impact, a prudent adult may decide to react to that risk, even though it's not very probable. As long as some risk exists in your mind, and as long as the potential costs of not taking action are outweighed by the costs of taking action, then it makes sense to take action. And that's the case for action. Okay, assuming you've decided that taking action makes sense, the hard part is where? We've been talking about some very big changes in the crash course, so where does one begin in this enormous universe of potential actions? Here's where I would recommend that you spend an hour and perform a self-assessment. There's an outline for this that you can download in the Act section of chrismartensondotcom, and it consists of 3 main areas. Your financial self-assessment should include your current and future needs, your current and future income, taking stock of all forms of wealth that you might hold, and any issues concerning accessing that wealth that may apply. Another area to cover I call foundational, and it's equally important, if not more so, than the financial areas. And lastly, there are all of your physical needs to consider. A typical result of conducting a self-assessment is discovering that our lives are very much dependent on a lot of things that we take for granted. Once you've got your self-assessment complete, you have a pretty good idea of where you are strong and where you are weak. The self-assessment then is your starting point. It represents your position in relation to the outside world. Now we need to go over to that outside world and rank all of the possible risks and challenges that exist that we will then match against our self-assessment. The three dimensions that we will use to begin bucketing the various events and risks are time, that is, how near or urgent is the risk or event; impact, is this a big deal or is it a little deal; and likelihood, which is the same as the probability of the event. To get a handle on time, consider grouping events on a timeline. In the first horizon, which I see as running from 0 to 2 years out, I place the housing bust, a credit bubble burst, and the possibility of a systemic banking failure. A bit further out, I foresee petroleum demand and supply crossing, issues with boomer retirement, and the possible emergence of very high inflation. Even further out, I see really big hairy challenges like national insolvency, perhaps the end of debt-based money, and the emergence of a new socio or economic model. Since I can't respond to all of these at once, I mainly focus on those that are within the immediate horizon. Again, you'll probably place very different things in each of these horizons, and those would be the ones you would use. These happen to be mine. For illustrative purposes, we'll run through an example based on the possibility of a systemic banking failure. Next, I segment things by impact and likelihood. If you understand insurance, you already understand this next process. Think of fire insurance on a house. We don't carry it because such an event is especially likely, because it isn't, but because the impact is so catastrophic. That is, a prudent person will combine impact and likelihood to come to the decision that purchasing fire insurance makes sense. So here's a way to do that in the other areas in your life. Suppose we construct a simple 2x2 chart, and on this axis we break the likelihood of the event into high and low buckets, while on the other axis we split the impact into high and low buckets. Something that is both low impact and low likelihood is something that we should not ever spend any of our precious time or resources on. Things that fall here are just not worth worrying about. Anything that is high impact and high likelihood is a slam dunk. We always attend to these, and we do them first. Things that are of high impact but low likelihood require more thought, but generally we would usually attend to most of the things in this box next. After that, we'd sometimes attend to the things that are low impact but high likelihood, especially if they happen to have easy or quick remedies. So this becomes the area where events fall that I attend to. How you happen to fill this in will depend on your age, financial means, family situation, and a host of other factors. Now, because I consider there to be a 50% chance of a systemic financial collapse at some point over the next 2 years, I place this as a high-impact, high-probability event, meaning that this is a risk that deserved and got my very highest attention. So let's continue with the example. With this 2x2 grid in our minds, we might flesh out the risks associated with financial system collapse using a table that looks like this. First, we might assess the likelihood of widespread bank closures to be high, the impact to be high, and therefore the rank of this event is high. Then we might come to the same conclusions about our own personal banks. But we might assess the overall rank of a disruption in the food distribution network as medium, and dollar destruction as medium because it has both a high and a low component, which average out to medium for us. We might assess cuts to government spending as low. These are just a few examples. Other things can and should be added to this list. The point here is to assess the likelihood and impact of each event that we think applies to the scenario we are studying. When you've completed this, you'll have a ranked list of events. My recommendation is that when you do these exercises, that you do them with like-minded friends. They will think of things that you're going to miss, it's more fun, and it will all go a lot faster. Now you've got to generate a list. You do this by filtering those events that are imminent, likely, and of high impact through your self-assessment. I guarantee when you do this, you will end up with an entirely too long list of things that you could possibly do. It's time to prioritize. First, the list can quickly be broken into things that you can or will do, and things that you can't or won't do. Of the things that you can or will do, we will break those into 3 tiers of action, such that Tier 1 is always started and completed, before beginning Tier 2, which will always precede Tier 3. This makes it much easier to get started because the lists are much more manageable. Of the things that you can't or won't do, your options include finding somebody else who can do them, and this is where community comes in, or letting them go and not worrying about them anymore. Now, back to our example. Let's suppose that after filtering your ranked events through your self-assessment, you came up with a nice long list of actions that you'd like to undertake. Almost certainly there are too many to do all at once, and it's time to use the three-tier system to identify and tackle the easiest, lowest cost, highest bang for the buck stuff first. So, what is Tier 1? It consists of the easiest, quickest, and cheapest items that require minimal outside assistance and no substantive changes to lifestyle. In this example, then, we might decide that taking a bit of hard cash out of the bank would provide a reasonable buffer against being without purchasing power should the banks and ATMs go on holiday for a while. This is very easy and doable. Our major risk here would be feeling a bit foolish later after nothing happens and we decide to go redeposit that money back in a bank. We might also decide to spread our bets around just in case the bank holiday was not universal and only applied to some banks. Lastly, we might decide to hedge against the vast loss of purchasing power that the people of Argentina experienced while their banks were shuttered. Gold represents one of the few ways to hold a money-like asset entirely outside of the banking system. And we'd do all of these things before even thinking about starting on the Tier 2 list. And so we proceed to Tier 2, which consists of those items that plug the biggest gaps in your self-assessment and require a significant investment of time, money, and energy. For instance, implementing a savings program so that you can afford needed items, or thinking about ways to create a food buffer for your community, or getting involved with your neighbors and local scene to a greater extent. All of these items represent Tier 2 actions. After these items have been gone through, it is time to consider the Tier 3 items, the hard stuff. These are the biggest changes or life decisions on your list, such as maybe changing where you live, or acquiring new skills, or maybe changing your job. The point is that you should resist the urge to spend any time or energy mulling these over until you've made serious progress on the Tier 1 and Tier 2 actions. If all of this seems like too much work and you are hoping Chapter 20 would be a more directive and simplified, here's what you do shopping list, I can only say that there are no easy answers for the magnitude of the challenges we face. This chapter could easily be an entire course itself, and future videos on my site will explore these topics in greater detail. What I have been consistently trying to prepare people for, the whole way along, is simply that the next 20 years are going to be unlike the last 20 years. Specifically, I think we each need to be prepared for a financial catastrophe. Not because we're 100% sure it will happen, but because we can't be 100% sure that it won't happen. Prudent adults identify and manage risks. And I think we each need to be prepared for the possibility that a disruption in our basic support systems could ensue. The things that surface in this line of thinking are considered quite out there in today's society, but barely 100 years ago, our complete dependence on the just-in-time delivery of the basics of life would have been considered mad. Lastly, I think the future is going to be about moving from an I to a we culture. Back to a bygone era where neighbors weren't just nice to each other, but relied on each other. As an informed person, it is now your responsibility to help others as best you can. Perhaps this will be with their knowledge and consent. Perhaps you will have to be more indirect if they are not yet ready to confront these changes. And so I close with a personal call of action to you. Now that you've completed the crash course, I hope you'll agree that the challenges we face are not being adequately addressed at the national or international levels. I created the crash course specifically to reach people one at a time because I hold the belief that some of the risks we are facing are moving much, much faster than the political process. I created the crash course so that you would understand what is going on and do my very best to help you appreciate that the future could be quite different from the past. And I need your help spreading the word. The crash course has been seen by hundreds of thousands of people all across the globe without any advertising on my part. This is because people like you have taken the time to pass it along to their friends, their relatives, and coworkers. But I want it to be seen by millions. We need to create a tipping point of awareness around these issues. And so I need your financial help too, because I have dedicated 4 years of my life and much of my bank account towards creating this body of work and then making it freely available to everyone. If you have gotten something from this, if it's touched you or even changed your thinking in an important way, then I hope you'll consider paying it forward by making a financial contribution so that somebody else down the line gets to see it too. How much? I would suggest an amount that is neither a stretch for you nor embarrassing. The crash course needs to be seen in the halls of power. I need to train others to deliver the message. I need to travel and take the show to venues both large and small. I need to support the development of multiple language translations. And I need to expand the content, shrink it, add new material, and keep the whole effort moving forward. In whatever way you can contribute to that, even if that's sending the link along to just one other person, I need your help. I will do my part if you do yours. That's my promise to you. Because after all, the future will be defined by what we do. Thank you for listening.